to the Black girl who learned to perform in order to be loved. I see you. Hey, it's Kaylin, a licensed clinical social worker and therapist in Atlanta, Georgia, and this is the Black Girl Scene podcast. Welcome back. So we're continuing with the series on facing your fears. If you haven't listened to the first two episodes, and especially the last one, the fear of being seen, please do so. It's got some really good foundational information on why we sometimes allow our fears to get in the way of what we want the most. So before we dive in, we'll start with our reflective question. And today I want to ask us, what's your relationship with being perfect? All right, today's theme is the fear of failure, and we are going to talk all about perfectionism. I mentioned in the last episode that I don't think we do a lot of justice to how we talk about perfectionism, and I have been itching to dive into this. So let's get into it. The fear of failure. So this one is really common. It's something that comes up a lot in my work, and it's like clockwork, this omen that you can't fail, although ironically, none of us can avoid making mistakes or failure. And it drives so much of how we show up in our lives, and not just in our work, but also in our relationships. I know a lot of the topics that I bring up in this space tend to be relationally focused. And so you might be thinking, okay, this is a bit of a switch. This is more about how I do work. Actually, this shows up in our relationships as well. And there is this relational root to perfectionism that we don't normally talk about. That's often what makes the fear of failure so powerful. It really matters to attend to this because it underpins our courage to show up in our life, for ourselves, and in our relationships. So in order to really unlearn perfectionism, we have to get to the root of it. As we do that, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself right now, yes, I relate. I'm a perfectionist. Some people may be saying, no, that's not me. I'm going to kind of set the tone for my operational definition of perfectionism. It's often this recurring and never-ending attempt to reach a flawless state that is tied to your sense of self-worth, right? So if you are feeling like the bar is always moving, if nothing ever feels good enough, if it feels so paramount to perform in a certain way, or feels like your world is going to crumble, that's often an experience of perfectionism. Now, perfectionism doesn't always mean you are overfunctioning, overworking. It might also mean that you struggle with procrastination and underperformance, because ultimately avoidance is a big piece of the anxiety that fuels perfectionism. So that often is this unconscious belief that it's better to not try at all than to try and fail. That feels more vulnerable. Another way to think about it is that perfectionism isn't just a constant fear of failure. It's the belief that failure is one of the biggest threats to your sense of self-worth and your relationships. So that is where the relational piece comes in. And honestly, that's where being seen comes in. We've talked before about these relational woundings that get in the way of our experience of being seen. And in the event that performance was a space where you were relationally harmed, then likely you developed an extreme aversion or fear to failure because it's a threat to your relational safety. Which brings me to my favorite definition of perfectionism. I think when we think about it this way, it really emphasizes the depth of what we're dealing with. Perfectionism is how we repeat the trauma of conditional love. When the attention, the love, the support, the care you receive over the lifespan is tied to how you perform, then you learn, I can't mess up. Or that might impact how people see me, how people accept me, how people love me. We don't always think about it that way. We tend to think about it as, no, I'm just striving for excellence. I just want to be the best. I just want to win. I just want to thrive. Those things are wonderful. And if it becomes this really deep experience of fear that can really shift your internal worldview, likely there's something tied to your survival there. And those things that tend to be tied to our survival and feeling triggered or feeling enormous anxiety that's really hard to work through that's often connected to relational woundings. So what are some examples of these relational woundings that may have sprouted into the fear of failure and perfectionism? We may have learned directly that performance was tied to your worth. I think I've referenced this in other episodes. This is really common for our athletes, our academically inclined individuals, people who played a really important role in the family's survival or even in the family's emotional functioning, because we don't always talk about it that way. You maybe weren't the oldest child who contributed to the home financially and helped babysit the siblings. You may be the one who did all the emotional labor. And that's absolutely coming in future episodes. We'll talk about that impact of family dynamics on us growing up. Maybe you only got attention or love when you performed. Maybe you were taught that nothing is ever good enough. So maybe you had a lot of pressure to perform in a certain way, but never got credit, celebration, acknowledgement. That's really significant here, because then you're like actually learning and seeing a dynamic telling you that no matter what you do, it's not good enough. Another way to think about this is that sometimes the areas where we experience perfectionism were the only safe places you had when relationships felt unstable. This is really classic for maybe you experienced bullying at school or criticism and rejection at home, but you had a really positive experience in the classroom. And so now you cling to academic excellence because that was the only place you felt safe, loved, and seen. Maybe that could be true for hobbies you have or other things tied to your career. Sometimes that's also true in relationships. Maybe you only felt safe in friendships, but you didn't feel safe in the family, or you didn't feel safe in dating relationships. And so you tend to overexert yourself in friendship spaces because those were the only ones that felt good. It could also come from having experiences with rejection and acceptance. So similar to what I just named, if you had these conditional experiences where because I was a good athlete, I was accepted in certain spaces, so that feels like my pathway to the acceptance I desire. On the other hand, experiencing rejection in other capacities. I also want to name experiences where if you didn't do as well and that felt more significant, even if the experience of doing well didn't offer you the attention or the support or the love that you wanted, that sometimes can produce our relationship with perfectionism and failure in a very strong avoidance capacity. It can start to feel like, well, what's the point of trying? What's the point of aiming for excellence when I realize it never got me what I needed? There's so many other examples. I'm sure I'm missing some, but those are some thematic things to help you consider your sourcing of perfectionism. And if I know the audience that this particular topic is probably drawing in, you're probably thinking, well, the perfectionism has worked for me. I'm doing well. I got good grades. I'm in a great career, or even I'm the super friend and everyone can lean on me. In some way, shape, or form, it feels like it was really effective, and likely it was. And you're probably burned out, or something just doesn't feel good or fulfilling, which is maybe what piqued your interest in this topic. So letting perfectionism stay as the driver in your car, it can catch up with you. Some ways that shows up is we rarely let ourselves stretch. So even if you identify as an overfunctioner, an overperformer, you still may experience avoidance where you won't try new things that you're not so good at. So you may be thriving in one way, and there may be other areas, other gifts, talents, experiences that you could grow in that could add a lot of richness to your life that we're not allowing ourselves to explore because we're so concerned about that disrupting us at the level of our identity. We sometimes end up living out of alignment with our true selves because we're choosing what others want us to choose. We're showing up in the ways that others need us to show up. And that's like one of the hallmarks of masking, right? And not allowing yourself to be seen. You don't want to mess up. You don't want to step outside of the lines that have been drawn for you. And that's really stifling. Perfectionism is like a gateway to people pleasing because in a way, that's what it is. Like, it might not feel that way consciously. And there's this sense of we're performing in order to please people. And I saw this on the internet. Shout out to whoever said it. I saw a graphic that said, "Are the people pleased?" And likely they're not pleased and will never be pleased. So even when you feel like you're capable of accessing certain boundaries or showing up in a relationship in a certain way, if there's a deep perfectionism root for you or a fear of failure, it's likely you are showing up very inauthentically and wanting to create an experience for someone else for your relational reassurance. But that's not ultimately you being you. Another big one is then you struggle to internalize your successes. You only tend to own your successes when there's a threat to the ego, but outside of that, you don't let it sink in. So I'm talking to the folks who struggle to receive compliments, the folks who, if you got the A, if you got the contract, if everything's okay, it just feels like relief to you. It just feels like, okay, I'm glad nothing quote unquote bad happened, but you don't celebrate it. It doesn't feel like an accomplishment. Or even for those of us who are in an experience that feels like, yes, this is an accomplishment, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like what you thought it would feel like. It feels kind of empty, right? Because we're really seeking this relational acceptance, which we'll get to. We're not actually seeking the thing that we work hard for. It's often a block to real authentic connection. So building off of living out of alignment or being disconnected from yourself, other people struggle to connect to you as well. They don't know as much of the real you. You probably struggle to be vulnerable or allow yourself to be seen. Why? Because the fear of failure is so connected to a fear of not being good enough. It's tied to your self-worth. So when we're struggling around that, we don't allow ourselves to be seen. We don't practice vulnerability, or if we do, there's often some limits to it. And so this is really hallmark for those of us who do so much work, or we really show up in our relationships, but we don't feel connected. We don't really actually experience true intimacy. We might have closeness, really might have consistency, but we don't have deep intimacy because we're not allowing others to see us. And I always tell people that if it feels like your relationship is unable to sustain through conflict, then you're always on guard because conflict feels like the thing that will break it apart. So it's really hard to feel truly relaxed and truly settled and secure, is what we're talking about, secure in our relationships, because we don't actually get to do the messy work of building the bond that involves mistakes, embarrassment, and openness, vulnerability, conflict, all of those things. And so ultimately, perfectionism can only take you so far, and it tends to get in the way of things that you really want. Also, spoiler alert, you can't avoid failure. We're human. We make mistakes. Mistakes are often what make us better and stronger and grow. And so we do all this work thinking that we can actually avoid the mistakes, whether it's that we don't try at all, or in some ways we try too hard, or we just overfunction, we overperform, not realizing that we're still going to experience failures, setbacks, challenges, mistakes. And, success, or I don't even want to call it success, outcomes that feel really connected to our effort, those long-term outcomes ultimately end up for folks who are willing to go the distance, people who could persevere through the most BS. That's it. We're all going to go through the mud to get where we're going. A lot of times what makes the difference between how it turns out is, can you stand the rain? But too often we allow the rain and the struggle to mean that we're messing up or that we are a failure, when in reality we are a human going through a human experience, and we get to learn through the challenges, not let it define us. So what do we do about this? It truly starts with tending to the relational root, because everything I just said sounds good and dandy. Mistakes are a part of the journey. Cool. What if a mistake means that I lose the love and acceptance of a parent? What if it means that my friends no longer include me? What does it mean if I experience rejection or loss in my romantic relationships? And again, I don't think a lot of us consciously think that if we fail this test, we will not be loved. And as you explore the relational root, you may learn the ways that you did develop this part of you through a relational wounding. And I want to also name that sometimes it's not that direct. Sometimes it's not, oh, my parent was upset if I didn't get good grades, so I learned to get my parents' acceptance through good grades. Sometimes it is that direct, and sometimes it's indirect, such as my parent was overwhelmed and I experienced a lot of emotional neglect, but they would respond to me and have energy around me when I brought home a good grade. That's when they got excited. That's when they hugged me, right? Or my parent was fundamentally maybe not the most emotionally present or the most emotionally healthy, but if I got a not so great grade on an exam, I'd get in trouble and I'd experience physical harm, right? So sometimes it's not so tied to, I told you, you need to do these things for my love and attention, but it can be this cumulative experience of what either protects you against harm or moves you toward connection. Two big motivators for our behaviors and our wounding. And again, it connects to being seen, because if we are debilitated by this anxiety that some way we show up will result in a loss in our relationships, then we're going to do a lot of work to stay hidden, to stay disconnected from ourselves, and to maybe build a life that protects us, but not a life that produces joy. As you tend to this relational root, and as always, if this is feeling heavy, or even if it just feels like an invitation to do this work with a mental health provider, I want you to trust that, and I want to invite you to explore that. We want to start with getting clear and honest on the source. So like I said, sometimes it's just not that direct, right? The gymnastics was your pathway to acceptance, that making a lot of money was going to be the way you were celebrated in your family, that by marrying the quote unquote perfect person was going to be the only way to get acceptance. It may not feel like a really straight line. And a lot of us learned to downplay a lot of what we experience, especially when it's tied to something that is as culturally celebrated as perfectionism. Like, I'm confident you or someone you know have been in a room and said, well, I'm a perfectionist, and announced it with this pride. I have done it too. I don't do it I can acknowledge I do not do it anymore, but I've done it. My colleagues have done it. I still hear so many people do it because it's conflated with just being a hard worker and striving for excellence. I think those are separate. I think those are okay. I think those are how we grow in life. I also said earlier in the episode, like, you probably think, well, perfectionism has helped me. And you're right. Most of our protective strategies are protective because they're effective and they have unintended consequences, which I just named. This is a place where we get to challenge ourselves and allow ourselves to see the truth, to see the spaces where we maybe learned just how connected our performance is to our worth. Then we want to connect with how this continues to unfold today in our lives. At work, are we constantly worrying about being reprimanded or fired if you make one mistake? Are we constantly going over hours or going the extra mile in spaces where, one, it's created maybe some burnout or even just some resentment for the role, but it feels so unnatural or unsafe to pull back? Are we worried about losing relationships if we're not the one paying the dinner bill, making all the phone calls, running all of the errands when someone needs you? Like, do you feel like your world will fall apart essentially if you stop showing up in the ways that you do? And again, this isn't, are you just showing up really well? Are you working hard? This is tied to a deep-seated fear that drives you to overcompensate for the things you're worried about losing. And so then you might also be thinking, well, yes, I don't want to lose my relationships. I don't want to stop showing up in ways that help me feel safer in relationship and community with people, especially maybe family or other folks whose relationships feel really foundational to you. But I want to invite you to reflect on this question. Are relationships that depend on me being perfect worth fighting for? Safe relationships do not operate on that type of conditional nature. What does it say if you are not allowed to be human in order to be in this relationship, right? So I think it's really important to take a step back when we're challenging ourselves around the role that perfectionism plays in our life and be honest. Is it working? Is this something I want to keep doing? Is this how I want to sustain? Right? Because the goal of this work is to reorient yourself, is to reorient your relationship to yourself with unconditional self-regard, and staying in relationships where any mistake, anything that feels so thin, where you cannot exist in your humanity, or the relationship will be severed or suffer might not be the safest relationships for you. And once you reorient your relationship to yourself with that unconditional self-regard, you allow that to carry over into relationships with others. So I'm really of the school of thought that there's a lot of grief work there, which is why I wanted to offer up space around this. Might be some therapy work for you. This might be some community work for you. But ultimately, we have to do some grief work around recognizing that perfectionism actually won't save us. I think that's a trend in all of our fears and all of these things that get in the way of us allowing ourselves to be seen, is recognizing that the protective behavior we've relied on for so long is maybe not going to be as effective in creating what we want. They're really effective in maybe stopping some of the harm or slowing some of the harm that we don't want, but they're not as great as facilitating the real, true things we desire. So sure, maybe it helped you get to the C-suite, and maybe we have a recurrent anxiety around losing it or losing the respect of others if something goes wrong, right? And this is, again, not to conflate it with general anxiety that comes with like having a high pressure position or a lot of people relying on you or just wanting to show up in your relationships. That makes sense. And does it have this deeper rooted fear in you that gets in the way of what you actually want? That's the key. So perfectionism won't save you. It won't protect you from failure. Failures and mistakes are still going to unfold. And failure is not the source of relationship fractures in the way that we learned. We learned that failure is the end all be all. It's the disruptor to your self-worth. That is the stuff we have to sit with. That is the stuff we have to unlearn. And it's hard. So there might be some grief work there. And we need new evidence, right? So for so long, we've been practicing perfectionism. We've been honoring this fear of failure, right? I love to say that we're honoring a fear when we show up in it. Again, it's normal. It's protective. This isn't to pathologize. I think when we say that we're honoring the fear, it shows how much we're like really giving reverence to the fear versus maybe some of the things that we actually want or are moving toward, right? So let's try not burning out and see if we still get results, if we still learn. Let's try being imperfect and seeing if we can still build sustainable relationships. Let's actually give it a try. One of my favorite experiences in my work with athletes is when I suggest to them that they do 10% less, that they switch some of their training time to recovery time. And then they look at me like I've lost it. And they look at me with so much doubt. And then I say something quirky like, you can do hard things. And if resting is hard, then make this a challenge. Whatever it is to kind of get some buy-in to try doing the opposite of what they haven't tried yet. And then the results start to peak. And then it's like, so maybe you don't have to burn out in order to see results. That's cool. They had to see it for themselves. So I want to invite you to do the same thing. And I want you to be curious about what you could try that isn't a part of your perfectionism toolkit and see if you can still have the outcomes you want. Then we have to practice internalizing the evidence, right? So there's so many of us who, I think I said this earlier, when you achieve something, it feels more like relief. When something goes right, it's just that you're glad it didn't go wrong, right? But we don't actually let that mean anything versus if something were to go left or something were to not work out, we're having a pity party, we're crashing out, we're upset, we're making it mean that we're not good enough, that nothing's ever good enough. We take that in, we internalize the moments that don't feel good, but then we really downplay the very thing that we were so pressured around experiencing. So I like to say, if it feels big when it doesn't work out, then let it matter when it does. We don't have to have a huge I would love that if we had huge parties every time things went well. And I recognize how that can still create this experience of I only throw parties for myself if something works out. But I do want us to make it matter, right? So again, this is for my folks who don't accept compliments, who never want to make a big deal when things work out. And again, ask yourself, how is that mirroring a relationship that harmed you before? Did someone else tell you that getting A's didn't matter because that's what you're supposed to do? Did someone not care how much you stood by their side when things were rough, but they were upset with you if you didn't call them enough following that? Like, how are we taking on and recreating the trauma of this conditional love? And that's kind of like your path too, asking yourself, how am I modeling the harm I received before by showing up this way? And how can I do it differently? And so as we end, like we're thinking about what does life look like beyond perfectionism. And I want to emphasize that it's not this finite thing where you just like get over it. It goes away. You're all good, right? It might come and go. That anxiety, pressure, the fear, feeling triggered, those things might ebb and flow, but we're going to build a toolbox to manage it differently and respond to it differently. Think about how powerful it might be the next time you're faced with anxiety around performance. And then you ask yourself, how can I show up for myself right now in a loving and unconditional way? Instead of asking yourself a million questions about how you're not doing good enough, how you're missing something, and going through the Rolodex of possible terrible outcomes, right? Like, just imagine how powerful that could be. And then the more you get that evidence that you can show up in your life differently and still experience the results that you want, relationally, work-wise, otherwise, then you start to define yourself differently. You start to define success differently. I think a huge indicator that you're moving beyond perfectionism is you start to celebrate the process over the outcome. You start to celebrate the fact that you made it to work on time. You start to celebrate the fact that you said hello to strangers. You start to celebrate the fact that you were able to feel kind emotions toward yourself. You start to celebrate the fact that something was really hard and you didn't quit, even if it didn't turn out the way you wanted it to, because those are the things that matter. And you start to see yourself separate from your performance. You start to see yourself separately from what you do. It's still a part of you. I don't know if it's possible or necessary that we completely detach from our work. I'd be lying if I said that. It matters to me what people think about Black Girl Scene, what people think about my work as a therapist, what people think about myself as a friend or a partner. Those things matter to me, and I recognize that they're not me, and both can be true. And when you start to notice a difference, when you start to separate the two, that's when you know that you're getting to a different space with your perfectionism. And then you stop feeling so constrained and like bound by this idea of flawlessness, and you start to embrace the messiness of life. And this is where the good stuff is. When you start to let yourself mess up. This might feel like a really silly story, but one day I went in the height of graduate school shopping, and when I got back to my apartment, I noticed that some of my cleaning supplies had spilled, and I was livid. And I'm not saying that these things shouldn't frustrate you, because it was very frustrating, especially now with the cost of things. But I was so frustrated, and I started to beat myself up about how I can't do anything right. And I remember just pausing, and I was like, what am I doing? Why am I crashing out over this bottle of cleaning supplies that I can easily go purchase again, when it is like so normal for little things like that to happen? Right. And I did have a relational experience of making mistakes that, albeit worth being upset about, but not the end of the world, but it becoming a huge deal and it becoming a reflection of me and what I do and don't do. And I realized how I was repeating that pattern in myself and literally ruining my day off. And that is one of the biggest shifts I had when it came to this root of perfectionism and beating yourself up. All of that just seemed to fall off of me that day, the same way that cleaning agent spilled out of that bottle. So I will forever thank whoever did not tighten that bottle, or even if it was me, I don't know how it happened to this day. But I'm so grateful for it, because I just remember feeling I became a witness to my process instead of being in it. And I'm not going to lie and say that I don't still crash out sometimes over things. I absolutely do. And I'm able to have a different response to it. And it happens a lot less, especially around the small things. I'm able to lean into it or make it funny or be upset about it, but it mean nothing about me. And that's what I want for you. So as we're closing up, I hope you took some mental notes and could connect some internal experiences here. And actually, I definitely want to encourage you to implement some of this. Think about the source of your relational root underneath your perfectionism. Think about how it's showing up in your life. Think about that grief work you need to do. And ask yourself, what would my life look like if I celebrated myself unconditionally? What would it look like if I reoriented myself and I wasn't the quote unquote tough love voice in my head who feels like I need to be hard on myself in order to be good enough? What happens when I become my own cheerleader, when I become my own best friend, and I see the best in myself day in and day out? Because when you do that, it breaks chains in you and it opens you up to being seen in your relationships in ways that are so healing. And I really want that for all of us. So as we come to the end of this episode, I want you to put that practice into motion this week. And if you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a comment, subscribe, share it with a friend, and stay tuned for more. And I want to close by saying to the Black girl who is working on loving herself unconditionally, I see you. Thanks for tuning in to the Black Girl Scene podcast. This podcast is meant for information purposes only and is not meant to substitute for medical advice. Although I'm a licensed therapist, this podcast does not establish a clinical relationship with you, the listener, nor does it replace a relationship with a licensed mental health professional. For more information and resources on finding a therapist or support, please visit www.blackgirlscene.com/support.